The Dark Scrolls. The chamber at Richmond lay cloaked in velvet shadows. Thick curtains muffled the rising sun, while wax candles sputtered in shallow brass holders, their smoke crawling toward the ceiling like restless spirits. A silence too heavy for a royal palace pressed against the walls, broken only by the faint rasp of a woman's breathing. On that bed of crimson silk lay Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England, a sovereign who for 4 decades had shaped the fate of nations with words sharper than any blade. Now she was still, save for the trembling of her lips and the slow dilation of eyes that once commanded armies. Her courtiers whispered in the corridors, servants lingered in doorways, but few dared to cross the threshold. To look upon her in those final days was to confront the undoing of a myth. She had been called the Virgin Queen, the divine guardian of Protestant England, the monarch whose very image was inseparable from the destiny of her realm. Her portraits had been composed as icons rather than likenesses, with alabaster skin, youthful features, and robes woven with celestial motifs. That image had been cultivated with ruthless precision, for the face of Elizabeth was not merely a woman's, it was England itself. To preserve that vision, the Queen endured agonies unspoken. She painted her flesh daily with a white paste brewed of lead and vinegar, a poison known even then to corrupt the body. She bound her torso in iron stays and whalebone corsets until her ribs pressed inward, the spine forced into unnatural rigidity. She smiled at banquets, danced with noblemen, thundered at Parliament, even as each gesture masked a body slowly decaying beneath its armor of silk and pigment. In the last weeks of her life, the mask began to crack. Observers recorded that she refused food, rejected counsel, and spent long hours standing motionless in the center of her chamber, eyes fixed on nothing, lips muttering fragments of Latin. At times she lashed out in fury when attendants approached, declaring she would not yield, she would not lie down. Her frame shuddered like a sapling in the wind, yet she resisted the very posture of death. When exhaustion overtook her, she collapsed only to rise again, staring into the corners of the room as though haunted by unseen figures. Some believed madness had consumed her. Others whispered of poison. None could ignore the terror etched on the faces of those allowed near her. No official autopsy was ever sanctioned. Kings and queens of England were not dissected as commoners, for their flesh was considered sacred, their bodies vessels of divine right. Yet the absence of formal record did not still the tide of rumor. Among the intimates who tended to her remains after the final breath, stories spread like wildfire, whispers of deformities, corruption, and sights too dreadful for history to acknowledge. What they uncovered when the garments were removed, when the layers of paint dissolved under warm cloth, was said to be a revelation so dangerous that silence became the only permissible response. Her body, they murmured, was buried twice. Once in the lead-lined coffin beneath Westminster, and again in the sealed lips of those who had seen the truth. Contemporaries remembered the Queen's final visage as waxen, drained of all vitality, lips cracked and bleeding, eyes staring without recognition. Yet behind closed doors, more ghastly details emerged. Beneath the powdered face lay skin blotched with black and green, erupting with sores and blisters. A stench of rot, sharper than any incense, filled the chamber when the corsets were cut away. Her chest bore wounds concealed for years, some still weeping, others crusted over with hardened scales. Physicians recoiled in horror, one crossing himself, another retreating to prayer. The figure before them was not the radiant icon of statecraft, but a woman ravaged by long affliction, who had danced and declaimed while her flesh wasted away. The afflictions could be explained, and in part, by the cosmetics that were her daily armor. The ceruse mixture, lead carbonate blended with vinegar, was known to produce a smooth, ghostly pallor that concealed age and imperfection. For Elizabeth, whose legitimacy and authority were bound to the illusion of eternal maidenhood, the substance became inseparable from her identity. Yet each application sank toxins into her bloodstream, attacking her organs with relentless patience. Her hairline receded, her skin thinned, and pain followed her like a shadow. Still, she refused to abandon the ritual. To reveal the natural face beneath would be to admit mortality, weakness, womanhood unadorned. An admission she could not allow in a court where her authority balanced on perception. What the attendants recorded in secret was far more than cosmetic ruin. Her liver, shrunken and blackened, resembled stone. Her kidneys had hardened like brittle parchment. Within the abdomen clung a dark fluid of unknown nature, viscous and metallic inside, scent, as though her very marrow had congealed into poison. Such descriptions suggest modern diagnoses, severe lead poisoning, organ failure. But the language of the time framed it in more ominous terms. The Queen was rotting from within, punished by forces unseen. The spectacle of divine sovereignty collapsing into corruption was more than a medical curiosity. It was a political catastrophe. For if Elizabeth's body was disfigured, if her virginity was marked not by purity, but by barrenness or disorder, then the myth sustaining Protestant England cracked apart. Enemies abroad and at home would seize upon such revelations as proof that God disfavored her reign. Her cult of virginity had been carefully woven into the fabric of state, making her both bride and mother of the nation. To admit that her body had failed, whether by disease, sterility, or deformity, was to imperil the entire structure of legitimacy. Thus silence prevailed. Those who washed her corpse, who dressed her for burial, or to secrecy under pain of death. Records vanished, letters burned, journals erased, yet whispers endured. Some claim to have seen a tumor beneath her left breast, ulcerated and oozing, concealed under layers of binding. Others spoke of a womb shriveled like old parchment, barren long before age should have withered it. Such accounts fed speculation that she suffered from hidden disorders, hormonal imbalance, ovarian failure, perhaps even congenital conditions that explained her lifelong refusal to marry and her reputation for violent mood. Still more sensational was the ancient tale from a Gloucestershire village that the real Elizabeth had died as a child, replaced by a boy disguised to preserve dynastic peace. This Bisley boy legend gained new fuel from descriptions of her broad chest, narrow hips, and portraits that in later years showed features more austere, even masculine. Scholars dismissed the tale as folklore, yet the secrecy surrounding her death gave it uncanny longevity. Behind every rumor lies the fact that those last hours were deliberately obscured. Guards stood posted outside the death chamber. Servants were dismissed or reassigned to distant estates. Physicians were threatened with charges of treason should they speak. When at last her body was borne to Westminster, the coffin was sealed in lead, layers of ritual smothering any chance of inspection. The funeral orations celebrated her victories, her wisdom, her divine mission, but not one word acknowledged her suffering, her body, her decline. The official record preserved only the myth, not the woman. Centuries later, the tomb remains unopened. Requests for forensic examination have been refused. The effigy sculpted for her funeral, modeled from a death mask, is the closest the world may ever come to seeing her as she truly was. Subtle asymmetries in the effigy suggest spinal curvature, uneven shoulders, a head tilted unnaturally. Surviving gowns in museums bear the stress marks of extreme care. Corseting, waists forced to impossible narrowness. Chemical analysis of her cosmetics confirms lethal concentrations of lead. From these fragments, a portrait emerges, not of the eternal virgin, but of a monarch who sacrificed her flesh to maintain the illusion that held a kingdom together. In the stillness of that spring of 1603, as candle smoke drifted and courtiers held their breath, a secret was interred alongside a queen. It was a secret deemed too perilous to record, too destabilizing to confess, too haunting to fade. The Virgin Queen was buried not only in stone, but in silence. Her reign had ended as it began, wrapped in myth. Yet behind the mask lay a truth that gnawed at the very bones of monarchy. And so the record closes its first page, with the sound of shovels striking earth, a coffin lowered, and the whisper of unanswered questions sealed beneath Westminster for 400 years. The death of a sovereign was never a simple transition of life to silence. In England at the dawn of the 17th century, the passing of Elizabeth was a convulsion that rippled through every corridor of power. Outside the guarded chamber, counselors whispered not of grief but of succession, stability, and the peril of rumor. For 45 years she had embodied the state, her visage stamped on coin, her name invoked in prayer, her image raised as the very bulwark against Catholic resurgence. When she breathed her last, the mask of constancy threatened to collapse, and with it the fragile edifice of Protestant England. The first concern was not mourning but concealment. The council understood that the Queen's body, if exposed in its ruined state, might serve as a weapon for enemies both foreign and domestic. France and Spain, watchful rivals, would seize upon any sign of divine disfavor. Catholic pamphleteers, always eager to brand Elizabeth a usurper, would twist deformity or dis-ease into proof that heaven had cursed her reign. Thus, the watchword was silence. Secrecy became state policy. The servants who had seen her wasted form were dismissed under threat. Physicians were compelled to swear loyalty not only to crown and country, but to oblivion itself. The handling of her remains became an exercise in theater. The coffin was constructed with unusual haste, lined in lead to prevent decay from escaping its walls. The embalming was conducted under flickering torchlight, attended by only a handful of trusted hands. What was said, what was seen, what was smelled in that chamber has never passed into official record. The accounts that survive live only in whispers, that a stench of chemicals, sharper than death, filled the air, that strange fluids seeped from the body, staining the linens dark, that the embalmers worked with trembling hands, averting their gaze as though the corpse were a forbidden idol. When the coffin was sealed, it was not merely to preserve, but to bury a scandal. Beyond the palace, London held its breath. Rumors leaked despite every precaution. Tales spread of the Queen's refusal to lie down, of her ghostly silence, of her staring eyes that saw spectres no one else could see. The more fanciful claimed she had battled demons in her chamber, others that she had muttered confessions of terrible secrets. The truth of her final hours became the stuff of tavern speculation, feeding a hunger for answers that official proclamations refused to satisfy. Meanwhile, the machinery of succession ground into motion. James of Scotland was named heir, couriers dispatched, proclamations issued with careful ceremony. Yet beneath the herald's trumpets lay unease. If Elizabeth's body were revealed to be monstrous, if her virginity proved not holy but pathological, if her image of majesty collapsed, the legitimacy of her successor might be imperiled before he even set foot on English soil. It was in those weeks of transition that the mythology had deemed. Elizabeth was presented not as a woman who had decayed, but as a monarch who had chosen eternity. Sermons declared she had gone to God untouched, undefiled, a paragon of chastity, whose body was merely a vessel for divine mission. Portraits already in circulation were copied, ensuring the alabaster face and crimson robes would endure in memory. No painter was permitted to capture her final likeness. The effigy sculpted for her funeral was smoothed into idealized symmetry, carved from a mask but corrected to erase any sign of agony. Thus the public never saw the ruin. They saw only the myth, gilded one final time for posterity. Yet even in controlled silence, the private accounts persisted. Certain attendants wrote cautiously to trusted correspondents of the horrors they had glimpsed. A few fragments survive, describing skin that peeled like parchment, joints stiffened to unnatural angles, hair that fell away in clumps when touched. Some claimed her torso bore scars of years-long afflictions, hidden under layers of fabric and jewels. More troubling were reports of a lesion near her chest, wrapped daily in bandages, never spoken of aloud. Whether cancer, abscess, or infection, the growth was said to have festered for years, concealed even from physicians lest the truth of weakness emerge. The womb, too, became a focus of whispered speculation. Midwives excluded from the death chamber passed along stories second-hand, of organs shriveled and inert, incapable of life long before age should have claimed them. To a society that bound monarchy to fertility, such an image carried both terror and fascination. Elizabeth had styled herself as England's virgin bride, a mother to her people rather than to children of her own flesh. That narrative sustained her authority. But if the barrenness had not been a choice, but a sentence written in her very body, what then? Was her virginity an act of piety, or a cruel fate of anatomy? No chronicle dared to state it outright, yet his suspicion crept into margins, into coded letters, into tavern gossip that lingers still. The fear of revelation extended beyond medicine into theology. In a kingdom forged by religious fracture, signs of deformity could be wielded as proof of divine wrath. If the queen's body was deformed, if her flesh was corrupted, then enemies would declare her reign illegitimate, her church a blasphemy. Such interpretations had been deployed against monarchs before. A hunched back, a withered limb, a barren womb, each could be cast as evidence of God's displeasure. The Privy Council understood this with chilling clarity. Thus, Elizabeth's death was managed not as a natural passing, but as a sacred performance. She was remembered as she must be, not as she was. The funeral itself became the stage upon which silence was enshrined. Thousands gathered in London to watch the cortege. The coffin, sealed and shrouded in purple, was borne on a great hearse, surrounded by banners and effigies. Bells toll. Across the city, hymns rose from every parish, and the people wept for the sovereign who had guided them through wars and storms. Yet none saw her face, none glimpsed her form. She was both present and absent, both real and mythic, carried not as a corpse but as a relic. The pageant affirmed what the council required, that Elizabeth had died as she had lived, untouchable, eternal, chosen. But in the archives of memory, a different narrative lingered. Scholars centuries later would piece together clues: the chemical residue in surviving cosmetics, the distorted wastes of preserved gowns, the asymmetry of the death effigy. Medical knowledge advanced, proposing diagnoses that the 17th century could not name: chronic poisoning, skeletal deformities, reproductive disorders. Each theory chipped away at the myth, revealing a woman of flesh and frailty beneath the crown. Yet the central fact remained unchallenged. Her tomb has never been opened. The ultimate evidence lies sealed in Westminster, guarded not by stone alone, but by centuries of reverence and fear. What unsettles most is not merely the possibility of illness, but the deliberate suppression of truth. Every monarchy guards its secrets, but Elizabeth's silence was absolute. Journals disappeared, letters burned, testimonies erased. The few who had seen the reality carried it to their graves. One wonders what passed through their minds in those final moments, whether pity for a woman consumed by her own mask, or horror at a sovereign who had demanded illusion at the cost of her own flesh. The silence they maintained speaks louder than words, suggesting that what they saw was not merely decay, but something that could unmake a kingdom's faith in itself. The legend of the Bisley boy illustrates how vacuum breeds invention. In a rural village, locals told of a princess who died in childhood, replaced by a boy dressed in her clothes to spare the wrath of a tyrant king. Folklore dismissed by scholars, yet the secret surrounding her body lent it an edge of plausibility. Observers of her portraits noted the square jaw, the broad shoulders, the narrowing hips. In her later years, artists painted her in increasingly androgynous form, neither wholly female nor male, as though reflecting an ambiguity the court could not acknowledge aloud. Whether illness, choice, or legend, the effect was the same. Her image drifted from woman to symbol, from mortal to myth. This second layer of the dossier closes with a paradox. Elizabeth, who had wielded her body as an emblem of sovereignty, died in a state that could have shattered that emblem entirely. Yet through silence and ritual, the ruin was transformed into sanctity. The Virgin Queen passed not as a woman afflicted, but as a saint beyond corruption. The truth of her flesh was denied so thoroughly that centuries later we still seek it in shadows. And thus the record presses onward, from the chamber of death into the deeper recesses of secrecy, where whispers of tumors, poisoned organs, and spectral identities echo still, daring us to imagine what lies beneath the stone slabs of Westminster, forever sealed, forever silent. The silence that followed Elizabeth's funeral was not peace, but strategy. In every parish across England, ministers spoke of her glory, of her chastity, of the hand of God that had preserved her for nearly half a century. None dared mention the rumors circling through taverns and noble halls alike. Yet in hushed corners, questions persisted. What had truly been hidden in that sealed coffin? Why such haste to inter her in lead and oak? Why such insistence that no eye glimpse her mortal remains? The answers hovered between fear and fascination, sustained by fragments too numerous to vanish and too dangerous to acknowledge. Among those fragments were tales of the Queen's spine, bent in unnatural curvature after decades bound in iron stays. It was said that when her corset was removed for the final time, her torso collapsed inward, ribs pressing against one another like a cage long overstrained. Some described shoulders tilted unevenly, one higher than the other, as though the body had rendered to gravity long before the spirit conceded. Others whispered of muscle wasted to strings, of bones that creaked audibly when attendants lifted her. The figure that had once stood proud in procession, radiant beneath golden embroidery, had been little more than scaffolding for pain. Equally troubling were the accounts of her chest, a swelling beneath the left breast, concealed by fabric and perfumed powders, had festered for years. When uncovered at last, it was said to bleed through bandages, exuding a stench no incense could mask. Some who saw it declared it the mark of cancer, a disease unnamed but not unseen. Others called it an abscess, a lingering infection allowed to rot unchecked. Whatever it was, Elizabeth had hidden it with iron discipline, confiding in no one, treating it perhaps in secret, while outwardly maintaining the illusion of vigor. To reveal such a wound would have been to admit mortality, and mortality was a currency she could not spend. But the most distant, herbing whispers concerned her womb. The Virgin Queen's body, it was said, revealed in death what her life had long suggested: sterility. Attendants described a uterus shriveled to parchment, dry and collapsed, indistinguishable from the dead tissue around it. In the 17th century, such an image was interpreted as divine confirmation of virginity. God himself, it was claimed, had preserved her untouched. Yet modern suspicion casts the sight in another light. Perhaps a congenital disorder, perhaps endocrine failure, perhaps the long decay of organs poisoned by lead and constrained by strain. Whatever the cause, the revelation cut to the heart of her myth. For Elizabeth had built her sovereignty on the sanctity of maidenhood, a purity wielded as political weapon. If that virginity was not chosen but imposed by frailty, then the myth that upheld the crown teetered on contradiction. The implications terrified her counselors. To admit that Elizabeth had been barren by nature rather than, and will was to strip her celibacy of sanctity. Her refusal to wed, once cast as heroic devotion to her people, could be reinterpreted as necessity forced by defect. Enemies would seize on the notion that she was not divine bride of the realm, but a woman incapable of fulfilling her sex. Such accusations could destabilize not only memory, but legitimacy. Thus the secrecy was redoubled, the coffin sealed, the lips of witnesses locked in silence. The climate of religious conflict magnified the peril. For decades, Protestant England had stood in defiance of Catholic Europe, its queen symbolizing the triumph of reform against Rome. Elizabeth's very body had been weaponized as emblem of providence, a virgin queen chosen by God to guard the true faith. If that body was discovered to be corrupted, ravaged by poison, deformed by stays, barren not by choice but by curse. Then Catholic voices would cry that the Almighty had judged her. Her death would become not a passage, but an indictment. To President Irv the Faith, the council chose myth over truth. Yet not all accepted the silence. In the years that followed, letters surfaced, hinting at secrets too great to suppress. A court official described her sudden fits of rage, her unwillingness to be touched, her terror of mirrors. Another noted how her portraits had grown increasingly abstract, her face smoothed to mask what time and affliction had wrought. One foreign envoy remarked upon her voice, grown deep and rasping, echoing more of a man than of a maid. Whether these observations were true or slander, they reinforced suspicion that Elizabeth's body had concealed more than age. The legend of disguise, already whispered in her lifetime, gained renewed vigor. The tale claimed that Elizabeth had died in childhood, replaced by a boy to avoid the wrath of her father. Scholars scoff, yet the story endured because it explained what others dared not say aloud, that the Queen's anatomy was ambiguous, her identity more mask than fact. Reports of narrow hips, broad chest, and ambiguous reproductive organs fed the tale. The secrecy of her burial only strengthened it, for what is hidden invites invention, and what is denied invites belief. These stories reveal more than prurience. They expose the anxieties of a nation bound to a single body. Elizabeth was more than a monarch. She was the embodiment of Protestant legitimacy, the barrier against Catholic resurgence, the mother of her people without being a mother in flesh. When she died, every imperfection in her body threatened to unravel the fabric of that mythology. A lesion could be cast as divine punishment. A barren womb could be painted as curse. Even madness in her final hours could be framed as judgment. Thus the council feared not disease itself, but its meaning. They feared not corruption of flesh, but corruption of symbol. The funeral effigy became the final act of concealment. Carved from her death mask, it nonetheless erased the marks of suffering. The features smoothed, the posture straightened, the body robed in magnificence. To the mourners she appeared untouched, radiant in eternal repose. That effigy still stands, a marble echo of the mask she wore in life. It preserves not the truth of her body, but the necessity of her myth. Centuries later, scholars pore over relics for clues. X-rays of the effigy suggest subtle asymmetry, perhaps scoliosis. Surviving gowns bear seams stretched by unnatural force, evidence of corsetry so tight it warped bone. Chemical analysis of cosmetics reveals lethal concentrations of lead. From these shards emerges a portrait of a woman who sacrificed her body to sustain her crown. Yet without access to the tomb, the final truth remains sealed. Every petition to examine her remains has been denied. The vault of Westminster defended not only by stone, but by reverence and fear. The persistence of silence raises its own questions. Why guard a corpse so fiercely? Why deny the inquiry of science? Perhaps because to uncover the truth would be to desecrate more than a body. It would unravel a myth woven into the fabric of England's identity. Elizabeth's reign is remembered as golden, her virginity as sacred, her person as divine. To reveal deformity, poison, sterility, or ambiguity would be to strip away sanctity and expose mortality. And for monarchy, myth is stronger than flesh. Thus the record drifts between silence and whisper, between fact and legend. In one version, Elizabeth died serene, sanctified, a virgin chosen by God. In another, she died corrupted, diseased, barren, a woman undone by vanity and secrecy. In yet another, she was not Elizabeth at all, but a substitute who played the role for 45 years. Each version reflects the fears and desires of those who tell it. Each version haunts the tomb still sealed. The story that survives is not the story of a body, but the story of a mask. For Elizabeth was always performance. A girl raised in suspicion, a queen who ruled by image, woman who concealed her wounds to project invulnerability. In death, the performance continued. Her flesh decayed, but her myth endured. And in that endurance lies the paradox. The virgin queen, who gave her body to illusion, remains immortal not in truth, but in silence. The silence imposed after Elizabeth's burial was not merely the silence of mourning. It was engineered, enforced, a silence with the weight of law and the edge of steel. For those who had glimpsed what lay beneath the veils, silence was the only permitted memory. Guards patrolled corridors, documents were seized, and the men and women who had prepared her body were dispersed into obscurity. Some were granted distant appointments, others disappeared entirely. Their absence was explanation enough. They had seen too much. Even as the cortege wound through London's streets, draped in purple and gold, the city swelled with unease. Bells tolled, hymns resounded, yet among the crowds ran currents of rumor darker than mourning. People spoke of how the Queen had refused to rest in her final days, of how she stood staring at shadows, of how her attendants feared to touch her. More daring tongues whispered of what had been found when the paint and brocade were stripped away. Such talk spread from tavern to market, from servant to merchant, until it clung to the very air of the capital. The council responded with proclamations lauding her purity, with sermons extolling her sanctity. But proclamations are powerless against whispers. The truth, or what passed for truth, lingered in fragments. Some fragments told of a body warped by decades of constraint, spine bent, chest compressed, organs shriveled. Others told of lesions concealed beneath perfumed cloth. Still others spoke of a womb reduced to dust, proof not of chastity, but of affliction. Each fragment was partial, contradictory, yet each hinted at a reality too grotesque to harmonize with the myth. And so, secrecy was doubled again, not by omission alone, but by invention. Her image was polished into marble perfection, her reign declared golden, her body untouchable. The narrative became armor, protecting not the Queen, but the kingdom itself. The fear was not merely scandal. It was annihilation of meaning. In a nation still trembling on the fault lines of religion, the body of the monarch was more than flesh. It was symbol, relic, testament. If her body was corrupted, if her organs bore witness to disease, then her reign could be cast as judgment, her church as heresy. Enemies across the Channel would seize upon it, declaring that England's Protestant queen had been cursed in her very flesh. The coffin sealed in Westminster was not only to hold a corpse, it was to hold back a tide that could unmake the realm. James of Scotland, now James of England, ascended the throne under this canopy of silence. He had been raised in suspicion, tutored in paranoia, and he understood the necessity of control. Elizabeth's secrets became his inheritance, not her weakness, but his burden to guard. For if the truth of her body emerged, his legitimacy might be shaken. His succession rested on continuity, on the notion that Elizabeth's reign flowed seamlessly into his own. To admit that she had died corrupted, diseased, or in deception would rupture that continuity. And so James ensured the tomb remained closed, the records expunged, the silence absolute. But silence never erases, it transforms. What could not be said as fact survived as legend. In the villages, the tale of the Bisley child spread like wildfire, that the real Elizabeth had perished in youth, replaced by a boy groomed for the role. The legend found fertile ground in the strangeness of her later years, in portraits that blurred the line between maiden and monarch, in rumors of a chest too broad, hips too narrow. Though scholars dismissed it as folly, the people repeated it with relish, for it explained what official history would not. It filled the void that silence had left. Others whispered of divine punishment. They claimed the sores that marred her flesh were signs of God's wrath, that the tumor by her breast was a mark of sin, that her barren womb was proof she had been forsaken. Such voices found echoes in Catholic pamphlets smuggled into the realm, which declared that England's Protestant experiment was doomed, its queen cursed. The council burned such pamphlets, hunted those who spread them, but still the whispers grew. For every silence imposed, rumor found a new tongue. The body entombed in Westminster thus became more than remains. It became a riddle, a locus of fear and fascination. No eye might see it, no hand might test it, yet its absence shaped the imagination of generations. Each century added layers of interpretation. In some accounts, she was saintly, her virginity confirmed by divine preservation. In others, she was grotesque, her flesh dissolved by vanity and poison. In still others, she was a phantom, not the woman she claimed, but a substitute whose disguise became dynasty. What bound these tales together was the coffin itself, that leaden vault sealed against time. As long as it remained unopened, every possibility could live within it. Scholars demanded inquiry, physicians argued for science, yet the church and crown refused. They understood what the whispers themselves proclaimed, that to disturb the tomb was to disturb more than bones. It was to disturb identity, legitimacy, history. In the stone silence of Westminster lay not only Elizabeth's corpse, but the myth of England itself. Centuries later, forensic science offered new eyes. Portraits were examined with X-rays, revealing underlayers where artists had reshaped her features, smoothed her lines, erased her age. Effigies were measured, showing subtle distortions of spine and shoulder. Surviving garments were tested, revealing toxic residues of lead, mercury, and arsenic. Each discovery peeled away another layer of illusion, suggesting a woman whose flesh bore the cost of power. Yet even with modern tools, the final truth eluded reach. For the tomb remained closed, the silence unbroken, the body still guarded by reverence and fear. In the archives of memory, one can still sense the unease of those final days. Servants watch, seeing her stand unmoving for hours, muttering to unseen phantoms. courtiers recoiling from her fury, uncertain whether they faced madness or possession. Physicians noting the tremors in her hands, the crimson in her eyes, the cracked lips that bled when she spoke. Each detail preserved in whispers rather than records, for to record was to confirm, and confirmation was peril. Thus history became a palimpsest, scraped clean of fact, yet stained with shadows that could not be erased. The fourth layer of the dossier closes on this paradox. A queen whose very body was the state, yet whose body could never be shown. She had lived behind masks of paint and silk, and in death the mask remained, enforced by decree. The silence that covered her was louder than confession, shaping memory more powerfully than truth. And so her story endured, not as certainty, but as riddle, sealed in a coffin, guarded by centuries, waiting for eyes that may never be permitted to see. The tomb remained closed, but the silence never rested. With every generation, the absence of certainty fed imagination, and imagination spun its own truths. Elizabeth's reign, remembered as golden, was also haunted by questions no proclamation could dispel. Her body had been lowered beneath Westminster in a coffin, sealed with lead and guarded by ceremony. Yet the mystery entombed with her spread far beyond those stones. It whispered in academic halls, flickered in tavern tales, and settled in the minds of all who pondered how much of monarchy was myth, how much was flesh. The successors who followed had little choice but to maintain that silence. James, her heir, owed his own legitimacy to continuity. He could not afford to unmask his predecessor. Later monarchs, whether Stuart or Hanover, looked back on her reign as a model of strength in an unstable world. To admit that behind the mask of majesty lay a woman ravaged by poison, bent by corsets, consumed by lesions, was to endanger this, the very foundation on which royal sanctity rested. And so, century by century, the silence hardened into doctrine, until it seemed treason itself to question what had been hidden. Yet traces endured. The effigy crafted for her funeral, studied centuries later, bore subtle asymmetries that spoke of suffering. Shoulders uneven, neck tilted, jaw strained. Surviving gowns displayed seams warped by unnatural tightness, evidence of a body forced into shapes for which bone and muscle were never designed. Cosmetics preserved in cabinets, once admired for their brilliance, revealed lethal concentrations of lead and mercury when tested by modern hands. Each artifact whispered the same refrain. Behind the shining myth was a woman who paid in flesh to sustain the illusion of eternity. Still, the most disturbing accounts were those of her womb, for here lay the heart of her legend. The Virgin Queen, mother of a nation, yet barren of children. In her lifetime, the absence of heirs was explained as her oik sacrifice, as refusal to bind herself to a man for the sake of England. But in death, when whispers spread of organs shriveled to parchment, of tissues collapsed into dust, the story shifted. Perhaps it had never been choice but compulsion, not sanctity but incapacity. Some speculated on congenital disorders, others on endocrine collapse, others still on poisons that had eroded fertility long before age. Whatever the cause, the discovery threatened to unmake the narrative. And so it was silenced, as though silence itself could preserve the myth. The implications reached beyond biology. If Elizabeth had ruled not from heroic will but from necessity imposed by her own body, then her virginity was no longer symbol, but sentence. It cast her entire reign in different light. Was she the architect of her destiny, or its captive? Did she wield the image of virginity with deliberate genius, or did she hide a frailty too dangerous to confess? History never answered. The council ensured it now. Ever would. And so scholars argue still, each theory circling the sealed tomb like moths about a lamp they cannot touch. Meanwhile, the legend of the Bisley child persisted, improbable yet unkillable. To those who believed, it explained everything. The androgynous portraits, the masculine jaw, the refusal to wed, the sealed coffin. If the real Elizabeth had died young, replaced by a boy to placate Henry's wrath, then the entire Tudor dynasty's last act was theater of deception. Scholars scoff, but the myth endures, for it speaks to a deeper truth, that Elizabeth's reign was always performance, and her very identity always contested. Whether she was woman, virgin, or impostor, she was above all a symbol constructed for power. Religion, too, clung to her memory with ambivalence. To Protestants, she was the chosen vessel, the virgin guardian of the true faith. To Catholics, she was the heretic queen, her barren womb proof of divine judgment. Each side used her body, or the silence around it, as argument. Her corpse, unseen, became scripture in itself, interpreted according to belief. That scripture has never been closed, for no one has ever read the original. The tomb remains locked, and thus interpretation is endless. Centuries passed, but the fascination did not fade. In the age of science, when bones were exhumed and analyzed, when kings and saints alike were tested with DNA, petitions arose to open Elizabeth's coffin. Each was denied, the church refused, the crown resisted. They offered reasons of sanctity, of respect, of preservation. But beneath those reasons lay fear. For what if the whispers proved true? What if the bones bore deformity, the organs traces of poison, the chromosomes anomalies? What if the myth of the Virgin Queen crumbled under the gaze of modern science? Such revelations might not unmake a kingdom now, but they could tarnish a legacy cherished as golden. And so the silence continues, more guarded now than ever. Modern historians attempt to construct her from fragments. They study portraits where layers of paint conceal earlier likenesses. They analyze inventories of her wardrobes, noting the excessive cost of fabrics that concealed more than they displayed. They scrutinize letters describing her moods, her rages, her refusals to be seen in moments of weakness. From these scraps, they build a portrait, a woman who endured agony for decades, who hid wounds with powders and silks, who ruled through performance as much as policy. Yet even in these reconstructions, the final truth eludes. For the one witness that cannot be silenced, the body itself, remains sealed away. What lingers most is not certainty, but unease. The image of Elizabeth, radiant in portraits, commanding in speech, belies the image whispered by attendants of a figure trembling in candlelight, muttering to shadows, bleeding from cracked lips, consumed by rot. Between those images lies a chasm that silence could never bridge. And so her legacy is twofold. The V.I. Ruggin, queen of myth, eternal, untouchable, and the hidden corpse of rumor, diseased, deformed, unrecorded. Both images coexist, neither erasing the other, both haunting the memory of England. This paradox is her true inheritance. She was at once sovereign and woman, myth and mortal, eternal and decaying. In life, she balanced those contradictions with brilliance, transforming weakness into symbol. In death, the contradictions broke free, too dangerous to admit, too compelling to forget. Her tomb holds not only bones, but questions. Questions about power, about gender, about the cost of illusion. Perhaps that is why it has never been opened, for to open it would be to confront not only Elizabeth's secrets, but the uncomfortable truth that monarchy itself rests on masks. In the vaulted silence of Westminster, the coffin still lies beneath stone slabs worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Pilgrims pass, unaware that beneath their feet rests a riddle unsolved. Scholars debate, believers pray, tourists gaze, yet the coffin remains undisturbed, its secret intact. It is a silence older than empires, heavier than stone, more enduring than memory. It is the silence of a queen buried twice, once in earth, once in myth. And so the record closes, not with revelation but with enigma. The Virgin Queen, whose reign defined an era, whose image became nation, whose body was both weapon and wound, still lies hidden. Her darkest secret remains sealed, whispered only in rumor, glimpsed only in fragments, preserved not in fact, but in fear. 4 centuries have passed, and still the silence holds. Perhaps it always will, for some truths, once buried, are deemed too dangerous ever to rise again. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.